Good morning. Today we're going to finish the book of Genesis. Taking us 20 days to read through these 50 chapters. And tomorrow is a Sunday morning, third Sunday of the month, so it'll be a communion Sunday. You're welcome to join us in person in Mabel and Sutton at 9 o'clock if you wish, or 10:30 in McHenry at Our Savior's, or online at 9 o'clock. And if you're online, it's with us in the morning. You're welcome to have communion elements ready and join us at that point in time as well. And then on Monday, we will combine tomorrow and Monday's readings as we begin our journey through the book of Exodus. But as we read these last two chapters of Genesis today, some people say that chapter 49 is Jacob's blessing of his 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. I don't know if they're all blessings or not, but it's Jacob's final words to his sons. And it begins in verse 1, "You'll gather around that I may tell you what will happen to you in the days to come." What will happen, not what may happen, what might happen, but what will happen. And he goes through, he says, "Assemble and hear, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel, your father." So here, he uses both of his names. And it's a reminder for us that these are the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. And Reuben starts, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and my, excelling in rank and excelling in power," and then unstable as water. Water, H2O is pretty stable that way. I mean, it can be frozen, it can be liquid, it can be a vapor. But the molecules of water are pretty stable, but it can move rapidly because it's a liquid. So I don't know, is that why it's unstable as water? I don't understand exactly that. Simon and Levi, brothers, weapons of violence, and it's, for in their anger they killed men, and in their whim they, cursed be their anger, for it's fierce and their wrath. And he says, "I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." So, it's not all blessings for sure. And then Judah, the third born, who, was, very instrumental in the talking with Jacob, Israel, to bring the family then to Egypt. But he was one, even though he was the fourth born son, had some qualities that the other brothers listened to and followed and heeded, and as well, Jacob, the father, listened as well. And he talks about Judah. There's probably more verses about Judah than there are of anyone else, even over Joseph. And then Zebulun, you'll be on the shore of the sea, a haven for ships, and at his border will be Sidon. And that, Sidon, that's the name of a town way up in the northern part there. And, Tyre and Sidon, that's Jesus' furthest journey, was to go to Tyre and Sidon. And, we know that he talked with this woman up there. Iskar is a strong donkey, and the donkey, nobody likes to be called a donkey, but as I thought about that, lying down between the sheepfolds, I know people who have sheep will get a donkey and have with their sheep, because this donkey will protect them from the coyotes, from the wolves, from trouble, and from themselves. So, there's, a strong donkey, a good shepherd, one who watches over all people and all of his, all of his possessions that way, his animals. But at the end of it, he bowed his shoulder to the burden and became a slave at forced labor. So again, that doesn't sound like a blessing. Dan will judge his people. He will be a snake by the roadside, a viper that bites the horse's heel, and again, not something that you really want to hear. You're going to be a viper along the roadside. And then verse 18 is kind of an interlude. "I wait for your salvation, O Lord." So Jacob is crying out to God, or speaking, appealing for God to come. And then we hear just, a single verse about Gad and Asher and Naphtali. And then we come to Joseph, a fruitful bough by a spring. And quite a bit there about Joseph. The blessings of your father are stronger than the blessings of eternal mountains, reading in verse 26. And so Joseph, he's been a blessing to so many, even though his brothers had sold him into slavery, but he had proven faithful to God and to his family, and was, in Jacob, the father, who had missed his son Joseph for so many years, then sees him, again, and then the last, Benjamin, is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and the evening dividing the spoil. And so these are the 12 tribes of Israel, as they will develop and come to be known. And as we get into the New Testament, Judah was there was a separation of Judah and Israel, in northern and southern kingdoms. And so we see some of these statements that Jacob, Israel, makes here in the future. And then he tells his sons, he charges them, verse 29, he charged them saying, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my ancestors. He wants to be buried in the same place as Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah, and at the same place as he buried his wife Rachel. And so verse 35, when Jacob ended his charge to his sons, he drew up his feet, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. What a beautiful way of saying that he died. He was gathered to his people. And, excuse me. And so then chapter 50 begins with Joseph weeping and commanded the physicians in his service to embalm his father. So it was a 40-day process to embalm Joseph, or Israel at that time. And it says the Egyptians wept for him for 70 days. So, they gathered into this time of mourning for this man who was the father of Joseph, who was, Joseph had saved so many people and was so well thought of. And we think about this now, that Joseph came to Egypt that way, sold into slavery, rose to power and fame. I'm going to say fame. Everybody knew of him and was thankful to him. But this time of Joseph's father and his brothers coming to Egypt in this time of famine is the very beginning of when the Israelites will become the slaves in Egypt that, years later, 400 years later, Moses frees, from slavery. And we get into that in the book of Exodus. So Joseph and Jacob and his brothers coming, to Egypt now, and being very well respected, turns around. And so chapter 50 goes on with Joseph and his brothers burying their father. And then the very last, beginning in verse 15, Joseph's brothers. What are we going to do now that dad is dead? Joseph may have been harboring and concealing his anger at us. And maybe all of a sudden, now that dad is no longer with us, Joseph is going to retaliate against us. And they come and they say, forgive the crime of your brothers. Forgive the crime of your brothers. And please forgive the crime of the servants of God. And says Joseph wept when they spoke to him in verse 17. And then his brothers also fell down and wept and said to him, we are here as your slaves. Joseph's dream all those years ago, those two dreams that set him, turned his brothers against him, were that, his brothers would bow down and worship him, and they would bow down before him. And that came true with them all coming to Egypt to get the grains and to be fed and to be nourished and be cared for. But Joseph's answer when they say, forgive us, says, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to harm me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people. He said, I myself will continue to provide for you and for your little ones. And this is an important verse, you know that, am I in the place of God? You know, in the Old Testament, it was God that forgave. And this was one of the things that Jesus got into so much hot water with the Pharisees that, you know, is it easier to say your sins are forgiven or to rise, take up your mat and walk? You know, for a person to be able to say someone else's sins were forgiven was just, you know, way out of line. And so here, you know, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? And then this, you know, the book of Genesis ends with the death of Joseph. And he says to his brothers, I am going to die. God will come to you and bring you out of the land, into the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. And when God comes, he will carry me from here. And so Joseph, too, was requesting to be buried not in Egypt, but in his home country. And so we see, you know, that's going to happen quite a few years later. So the book of Genesis is the story of the beginning, many beginnings, the beginning of creation, the beginning of the Israelites being chosen by God, a new beginning after Noah and the flood. And it's, you know, interesting to keep track of all this and to see all of what goes on and how, you know, like in Joseph's case, which we've just been reading, you know, God didn't abandon him, and Joseph didn't abandon his faith in God, his trust in God, and valued family. Yeah, and family, truly, is a tremendous blessing to have.